Today, we are going to talk about trauma and what that means in terms of our mental health and our psychological functioning. And what's interesting, it's the issue of trauma was absent for many years, particularly in France. And then suddenly, in the past few years, it became the leading paradigm in our field, which has problems of its own. So how did this trauma field come into being? It is part of, everything is part of politics, our political system, and what's happening in the world. And at some point, it started in the US, that America has a very large army. That army goes abroad, and a lot of people come home. They come home wounded. It's interesting that the organization for talking about trauma happened in America after Vietnam. It happened in France much longer time ago. In France, there was a very rich literature already after the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, and also extensive descriptions about shell shock in the First World War. So it starts off with wars that people suddenly see how profoundly disturbed people are. But slowly over time, we got to realize that for every soldier who gets hurt in a war, there's at least 30 children who get hurt at home than their own parents. And so it's a very complex issue of what is trauma. So when we started to put together a diagnosis back in 1980, and a diagnosis of PTSD, we had to be very careful. And we said, this is the result of an extraordinary event that's outside of the usual range of human experiences. That tells you how limited we were in our understanding, because since that time, we have learned how incredibly pervasive trauma is in people's lives and what the long-term effect it has on a very, very large number of people. And so the way we first defined PTSD was an extraordinary event, and we defined it as a memory problem, and that the memory of the past becomes overwhelming. That is a complicated issue. Yes, trauma is about memory to some degree, but even more, trauma changes how you perceive your current reality. It changes how you take in what's important and what's unimportant. Trauma changes who you are in relationship to your own body. And so it is really about the internal, the trauma used to be out there, but now lives on inside of you, and you feel very terrified, angry, frightened, and out of control right now. It doesn't feel like it's in response to what happened to you in the past. It's a function of what is happening right now. And your kids may be noisy and you may beat them up. Your partner may be a little, do something, and you suddenly become violently angry or profoundly shut down. And so it's lived out in the present because certain stimuli make your body automatically experience the present as if you're back in your trauma. But for most people, when they blow up at their spouses or at their children, they don't say, oh, you remind me of my father who was a drunk, or you remind me about the accident I was in. It feels like it's happening right now. And only in therapy do you get to understand and appreciate that this is an old reaction to old events. The other important thing is that we defined PTSD in 1980. It's not a long time ago. And there is something in our culture where people, particularly in America, I think, where people like to say, I have found the best treatment, the treatment of choice. I'd be very skeptical of that. I probably have studied more different treatments of trauma than anybody else alive. And different people need different treatments at different points, and no one treatment is the perfect treatment. And that's important to keep in mind. So, for example, I'm very heartened by the Webb telescope. To my mind, the Webb telescope is one of the greatest accomplishments ever from human beings, that 30 years ago we could see tiny specks out in the universe, and today we can see a gigantic nebula inside that little dot, and we see things differently. So today we know things, and 10 years from now we'll know more and different things, and maybe old stuff will be forgotten. And so it's an ongoing, culturally based phenomenon. And what we also know is that one trauma follows up another. And so people like to think about trauma, oh, it's that event, that rape, that car accident that really puts you over. But in fact, what we discovered early on already is that one trauma builds up on another. And what we saw already when we first defined PTSD in combat soldiers, we saw that many of these combat soldiers had escaped very difficult home circumstances, and then they went to war, and they actually felt much stronger going to war. They had a uniform on, they had structure, they had prestige, they had a job, and they did very well in the army. But once their best friend got blown up, once something very personal happened to them, all this stuff came back and they lost control over themselves. And so one thing leads to another, and if you had lots of prior trauma, it makes life much more difficult for you. So the other thing that still is not part of the culture in America either, but it will be, I'm sure, and that's that most trauma starts in childhood, and the most pervasive form of trauma is trauma early in your life, where the people who are closest to you beat you up, molest you, humiliate you, put you down. Because early on in life, our brain is very open and malleable and takes on abusive experience in a very deep way. We'll talk about that. So that's the beginning. And then I'd like to show you a movie that illustrates what trauma looks like. And it's just a simple movie of a British soldier who has come back home from the war in Kosovo, who goes shopping with his grandma in the supermarket. A very ordinary situation.
You find the ingredients of a fruit cake.
You could just buy one.
So let's focus on the mother first, the grandmother. And the way she walks, she has a goal in mind, and she has a very sharp focus in what she is doing, and it expresses itself in the way that her body moves.
You find the ingredients of a fruit cake.
And there she goes like a bat out of hell. So that's what a non-traumatized person does. Where you're not traumatized, you're able to focus on what needs to be done. You pay attention to the goal. You don't get distracted by other things, and your body moves in a very purposeful way. Very different from her traumatized soldier grandson. And there's the grandson. He's slouching. This is the first thing that struck me working with traumatized veterans, is that their bodies were not purposefully moving, and they were sort of lost. And I always like to, as you'll hear, I like a lot about the history of psychiatry. And I'm reminded of what Ivan Pavlov said. Ivan Pavlov won the Nobel Prize in 1904 for a very important study that is at the core of what trauma is about, namely the conditioned emotional response. And what Pavlov found is that, as you know, that he presents dogs with food and rings a bell at the same time, and after a while, when the bell rings, but he doesn't give food, the dogs still behave as if they're being presented with food, and they secrete the right hormones to digest food, even though there is no food. That's exactly what happens in traumatized people. The danger has, in fact, objectively disappeared, but a certain sound, a certain smell, a certain body sensation brings it all back, and you behave again as if the trauma is occurring. So that was Pavlov's first study that everybody knows about. But there was another important thing. In 1924, so after the Bolshevik Revolution, there's a flood in St. Petersburg. And Pavlov's lab is on the river Neva, and the icy water of that river come into the laboratory, and the dogs stand up to their chest in icy water for a little while. They pump like crazy to get the water out, and none of the dogs died, but they opened the cages, and these dogs have completely changed. They lie down when they're supposed to move, they bite people when they're supposed to be handling them, and they clearly are messed up. Now, a lesser scientist would have said, oh, my dogs got messed up. Let's start to get some new dogs from my laboratory. But Pavlov is a real scientist. He says, I wonder what happened to my dogs. So he studies what happened to his dogs that made him so behave so strangely. And the conclusion he comes to is that when an animal, human beings, mammals, are exposed to danger, they're supposed to engage their fight-flight reaction. If something terrifying happens to us, we want to move or we want to fight. And if we can't do that, we get paralyzed and we freeze. And what Pavlov says at this point, he says, my dogs were meant to flee and to fight, but because they were in cages, as the cold water came in, they could not move. And because of their inability to physically move, they got stuck, and something happened in their brain that made them keep reacting as if the trauma was still going on. And we'll see other evidence of that he was exactly right in showing that. So Pavlov says the origin of trauma is physical immobilization, that there is nothing that your body can do, and because you're physically immobilized, something changes in your brain, and we're going to talk about what changes in your brain. So here's this guy who sort of walks through the supermarket in a totally constricted and frozen way.
You find the ingredients of a fruitcake.
You could just buy one.
I'm going to make you one.
I can't afford anything else. I want to get back. I can't afford anything else. I haven't got 15 quid in my pockets. Look, hang on a minute, let go. How much is this?
So his attention is suddenly drawn to something of a mother fighting with her 6-year-old baby or something like that. And we all see things like that. And most of us, when we see a scene like this in a supermarket or in a parking lot, we go like, they'll figure it out. And we don't go and do something about it, although some people do. And so some people are wired to go there about some situation, and other people go like, they'll figure it out. So there's something about what is your mind and your brain attracted to. And that's something you have very little control over. In fact, this is one of the oldest questions in psychiatry, is what turns people on? What draws your attention, and what do you ignore? And what you see when people are traumatized, their filtering system of what's relevant or irrelevant is changed. And things that for other people are completely irrelevant, for you becomes unbelievably important. And things that for other people are really relevant, like going to a bar where people are drinking and they're rowdy, most of us go, I'm not going to go here because a fight might break out. But if you're traumatized, you may actually have been exposed to a lot of violent scenes, and you have learned to not feel anything. So you don't pick up danger signs. I say your whole perception of danger is changed. In this case, the guy, for some reason, goes over there and is triggered by this fight to do something.